I found it really interesting in that film that we just saw. It was absolutely fascinating to me that the height of the whole film, in a sense, was a celebration of medieval art. Wasn't that totally bizarre? And so that was fantastic for me because I'm a curator of medieval manuscripts, and the medieval period is really what inspires so many people about Oxford. It's certainly the reason why I'm here, but um, and it's such a great period because it's completely lacking in a sense that the ability to possess it fully. As that film pointed out just now, almost no medieval art is actually signed. It's a celebration of humanity, of nature, of God, of everything. And the whole to me that the oh, here we go. We have sound now. Perfect. The whole my reaction to that film that we just saw was that the problem with fakery, with forgery, is really that every single everything that we saw in that film was real, in the sense that it's a story about people, and every person that we saw in that, we could relate to that film because every single person we saw was a real person, even if they were perhaps coming up with an unusual story. And the problem that film set out, in my view, was that right from the beginning, that there's all these men who are seeing a real person, but the problem that we saw, and the reason why they look so ridiculous to us, is that they're not looking to celebrate that person. They're not looking to look more into that story, but they're looking to possess that person, and they don't really care about who that person is, and that makes it difficult for people to exist. That makes it difficult, and that's really, in a sense, what prompts people to be ridiculous, to try to come up with unusual ways to be remarkable. And so I think, so in a place like Oxford, to come to the point, I feel that this is a chance to really pick apart what's going on, and to be concerned about, these are people, these are real people, and isn't it so exciting to be able to just look and pick apart these stories without actually having to worry about without having to necessarily worry about anything more than actually celebrating those people in itself.
I think the line I'm definitely going to take away is unusual ways to be remarkable. What are your thoughts, Patricia?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for coming this evening, and also for participating in this event. And I'm fascinated by this film because parts of it hasn't aged well, let's just be honest. But I was like, how long is this Oya bit going on for? But actually, at the time when it came out, it was quite popular in Europe, but it went down really badly in America. Didn't do well in America, and Orson Welles said, well, they don't understand my art or something. But actually then said at the time, America wasn't really ready to have a relationship that was questioning of experts. And he thought that these were questions that were much more part of kind of European culture, to question institutions and experts. And I found that to be quite interesting to look back on it now. The film's had a kind of resurgence. It's now got this kind of cult status, and people are looking back on it, these questions of real and fake, in a different way. As JC mentioned, I've been researching the fake essay industry. So these are essentially shadow scholars who are primarily based in Nairobi. So the epicenter of them is actually Nairobi. And there's a conservative estimate by the Oxford Internet Institute. There's around 80,000 of them just in Nairobi alone. And they sit exams, they write papers, they write theses, they write books for other people, academics and students all over the world. And so I went there to speak with them, and it was absolutely fascinating to me because, of course, they were like, well, how do we know that you are who you say you are? Because they spend all their time dealing with people who, forge who they are. But what was really fascinating was they engaged with my work more than some of my colleagues, because in order to authenticate who I am, they read all my papers, right? So they were like, that time and you said in this paper, and I was like, God, that was 10 years ago. I can't even remember what I said, what my argument was in that paper. But it was really interesting to me that there was no part of how they worked that took anything on face value. And the only way that they could engage with something, as whether it was as someone, as whether they were real or fake, was just through a kind of critical relationship with that person. So they asked me, I was really interested because they were like, your website, your university website looks like a mock-up. It looks like a fake. What's this? I was like, no, that's my genuine Oxford website. It just, none of the things that we would normally give to provide assurances actually works in a space where people just deal with this kind of reproduction of fakes all the time. And so the only thing that gave them any kind of assurance was just that I knew my work, and they were jumping backwards and forwards between. So the first time I met some of the writers, so they either like to be called academic writers or intellectual surrogates. So the first time I met them was in a kind of a group of about eight of them, and they basically quizzed me on all sorts of things, which was really fascinating. This kind of idea that you just don't take on face value. Even the fact I was from Oxford and I had absolutely no currency. It was whether I knew what I was talking about or not. And so being in a space where there is no longer any deference to institutions or to even to titles is really interesting when they're sort of doing this kind of work.
Thank you. I'm just going to stand so I can see if anybody has any questions. Have we got any questions yet? Yes.
Patricia, so you're talking about maybe the kind of privilege and power that's involved in who's considered an expert, and also, and then maybe linking up with the movie a bit more, who can judge a fake. Is there any kind of a power or privilege that comes with being a fake?
I mean, that's a really good question, isn't it? I think that if I'm talking on behalf of the writers in Kenya, for example, they don't consider themselves a fake. They think the people who take their work are fakes, right? So they feel like it's a very insecure place, because as far as they're concerned, at any moment, the people who have bought their qualifications or who get tenure on the basis of a book that they've written, or, they've written PhDs for people in like 2 years, they feel at any moment something's going to happen that maybe might expose that person. So they feel that they are the real one, and the people who purchase their works are fake. So the question then becomes, from which angle is something a real or fake, and who gets to say that? Because, for me to watch somebody produce a piece of work that they then send to somebody else at a kind of Ivy League or red brick university, and that person will do that piece of work in, I don't know, 6 hours or whatever, and they know that that person will then go on to get, an A or whatever. For them, that's real. There was one story where one of the writers got really fed up of the writing and thought, oh, you know what, I'm just going to apply for a job. And they applied for a job at this Ivy League university, and they didn't get it. But they wrote back and said, I knew I wasn't going to get this job because I did it in my name. But by the way, I've been writing for you for all these years, and here's all the people I've produced work for. They're fake, I'm real. So I think actually who gets to say who's fake and who's real is really interesting, and the vantage point is also fascinating.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, isn't it easier to do fake in Oxford than anywhere else, because you have the currency of authenticity around you? So I've just tested my first year students and trying to claim things to be medieval traditions, and they would normally believe it because everything in Oxford is a tradition. So other than you said, and hasn't it always been the case in a way since White that it has built on having traditions around you to create new traditions?
Absolutely, yes. And to go back to the point of privilege, I think it's in itself a privilege to be able to simply say, oh, this is actually, well, so for example, Patricia. So Patricia, by the way, if you haven't caught the whole context of this event, this has been an incredible journey, because that only started for me at least 2 months ago, when Patricia wrote all of the through Torch, got all of the gardens, libraries, and museums institutions. That's the Bodleian, the Ashmolean, History of Science Museum, the Botanic Garden, Pitt Rivers, and Natural History Museum. I think I've got them all. And in spite of these all being in the same division, it's really difficult to get all these institutions to work together. And so Patricia got this, masterminded this plan to simply get us all to talk about forgeries. And that hit such a chord for all of us, because we all thought, oh, wow, this is, this ticks on so many points, so many problems of exactly this living in Oxford. And so for me, I put together a little case in the Bodleian showing, here are some fake things in the Bodleian Library. So we have, for example, a Book of Hours that claims to have been brought to England by Anne of Cleves, and it's this whole story that was put together based on this miniature, this little painting that was added to this manuscript in the 19th century. And so for me, I was able to simply say, oh well, this is obviously not a real miniature, but that's fine. This is because we have 10,000 manuscripts medieval manuscripts in the Bodleian Library. By contrast, I'm from Canada. We have about maybe 170 manuscripts in Canada. And so for me, I'm able to, as a curator at this incredible place, I'm able to say, well, this is still a great story. There's lots to discover here. Let's look at this as an example of reception, as a story. Whereas if I were someone in rural Canada and this was my one medieval manuscript, I would be absolutely crushed and say, well, we don't have any medieval manuscripts anymore. That was that's it. So I think being able to pull things apart, that I think that in itself is that in itself is a point of privilege, and that in itself also goes back to there's a story of St. Frideswide that Henrika mentioned, and people have been trying to again come up with proofs for did Frideswide, who is this Anglo-Saxon princess who's said to have died in the 8th century. The first mention of her is in the 11th century, however, and people have been, basically had the ability to just look at Frideswide without too much concern over whether she existed, but to simply look at her as basically a figurehead that they could use for this city, for a nascent university, going back to the 12th century, and simply looking at the effect that these rituals, these traditions had. That in itself is a really interesting point of living here and of just in what a special and privileged place this actually is.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Yes, thank you.
Yes, I love the movie and I'm really inspired by both of your comments. I am finding myself thinking about the importance of power in expertise. You both shared and you've seen that expertise is actually much more inclusive than the kind of locus of possession and power. But I guess in the kind of world that we live in which disinformation exists and it is historically so possible to fake, where does power and expertise sit in all of this, and how do you reclaim power or exercise it and be an expert about it?
I think it's really interesting, this question about power, because so yesterday I had a really fantastic discussion, which I think is going to be available as part of April Fakes Day, with Vernon Rapley of the V&A. He's a former Met Police officer, worked 24 years for the Met Police and this sort of art fraud bit. And I don't think that's the actual official name of the department, but I can't the bit that deals with the art stuff. And then 10 years at the V&A, and we had a really interesting discussion because some of the art forgers who I've met have always said, you know, it's a subversive thing. It's a way to really show that there's none of these experts, and actually, you know, who are these people? Who have elected them to, you know? But he says, no, that's all rubbish. It just comes down to money. Most people forge stuff. It's nothing to do with subversion. They might give that as their primary reason, but none of these people ever donate the money to charity after they've after they've done these subversive acts, you know. So it's really interesting where power lies in this, because often some of these art forgers will present themselves almost as these kind of Robin Hood characters, you know, really revealing to us how corrupt the art world is and how privileged it is. And there's a part of me that quite likes that romantic story, you know, of them going in, and some of the art forgers in the UK, you know, I've really kind of warmed to them as characters. There's actually in Vienna there's a museum of fakers that's dedicated just to fakers, and they've got some Elmer paintings there, and they often will present you know, subverting power as their argument. And I think it's probably just much more complicated than that. I think there's power in different ways, and that's, yeah.
I think in terms of having power over other people, actually the out of all of the displays that we had over the past weekend, the one that struck me the most was the one that JC put together, because for so many, you know, the spaghetti tree at the Arboretum, you know, many of these are they're fun, they're stories. You look at them and say, oh well, maybe, you know, in the case of a piece of art, maybe a museum spent more money on this some years ago than they should have, than they needed to, but it's still, you know, an interesting object. But I wonder if you might want to, but then I looked at this display of medicine that JC had put together and thought, wow, you know, this is something that could kill me. And I wonder if you might actually want to say a bit more about that.
Well, I think it's very interesting about when fakes matter and when they don't. Like you were saying, if it's an artwork, or, you know, if we think about fake designer goods, right? There's first of all the myths around it that, oh yes, it's definitely all made in the same factory and they just change the name before it goes through the door. And so I think sometimes in those cases people think, well, you know, fakes, do they really matter? But yes, at the History of Science Museum we have a display on falsified medicines. And when you think particularly in the countries that don't have strong regulatory systems, and people are choosing a medication based on, you know, very little money that they might have that could actually end up killing them instead of curing them, suddenly the question of fakes become, you know, a lot more serious. So I think what's wonderful about what April Fakes Day has curated is it takes us through this whole journey of when fakes matter and makes us question, really, what is it? Where is the turning point around that power that suddenly faking it becomes, you know, we joke again, fake it till you make it. But actually, what if that making it has very deadly consequences at the end of it? So we only have time for one more question, I'm afraid. If anybody has a burning question at all. Yes, at the back.
Sure. I don't know if you can see me, but that probably doesn't matter. So I didn't know any of the stories in the film, minus the stories about the artists themselves and their names. But for all I know, all of it could have been fake. But I think what was real for me were the questions about expertise, as well as sort of my feelings about fakes and about the stories themselves. So I was wondering if maybe you could just reflect a little bit about what fakes can tell us about our values and how that might have come into your work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, I spend quite a lot of time thinking about this. Well, for absolutely Amadahuri, or whatever the last part of his name is, because there's about 60 different variations, but always Alma. He's a real person. He's one of the most prolific art forgers that's ever existed in history, and his paintings still hang on the walls of museums. Every year they discover another Elmer, another Picasso that everybody thought was a Picasso, and now it's actually, so he's actually a genuine, real character. And as I said, there's a whole section of the Museum of Fakers in Vienna that's dedicated just to him. But in terms of revealing values, I think the fake is really fascinating for actually revealing where we have a problem and where we don't have a problem. So, for example, with the writers in Kenya, some of them have really strong feelings about writing for doctors, faking exams for doctors, another, because that's really big business. If you want to sit a doctor's exam for them, you know, you're going to get paid like 3 times more than other people than if you were faking it for, I don't know, a sociologist. There's no money in that at all for them. But some of them actually say, no, I just refuse. I refuse to do that. So even within something that we might argue is actually kind of morally ambiguous, they have some very clear lines of things they will and won't do. And that's itself quite revealing, because they will say, well, I don't want to be responsible for a child having been seen by a doctor in the UK or the US who hasn't sat their exams properly. That for me is a line too far. But other people will say, well, you're not really, because nobody ever works alone, and these doctors work in teams, and, you know, so they'll find other ways of justifying it. So I find those things also quite fascinating, where people will draw the line, or what isn't a problem.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've come to time. I'm sure you would like to engage with all of this work more. So Patricia has a documentary coming out precisely about, and it's going to be on, it's BFI sponsored, it's going to be on on Film 4, about the fake essay writers in Kenya who are servicing academics, scholars, doctors, hopefully not mine, all around the world.
Or mine.
and Andrew has a book coming out about St. Friedewald, to bring it back to Oxford, and looking at the intersection of myth and history. As you've already heard, at the History of Science Museum, we have the display on falsified medicines, and at all of these other places, there's incredible displays or activities you can get involved with. So thank you so much for coming. Before you leave, there are surveys that are on the chairs, either under your chair or the chair next to it. Please do help us by filling them in. It's really, really helpful for us to understand what this event has been like for you. So if you could fill those in before you leave, would be very grateful. And have a good evening. Thank you.